Everything you were taught about Texas was built on a story. A story about brave men dying for freedom at a small mission in San Antonio. Remember the Alamo? You've heard it 1,000 times. But what if the freedom they were dying for wasn't yours? What if it was the freedom to own other human beings? You might be surprised that the people who actually built Texas were erased from its history before the ink was dry. This is the entire history of Texas, the real one. And it starts long before the Alamo, with an empire most Americans have never heard of. If that sounds like a story worth hearing, hit the subscribe button now. This one changes everything you thought you knew. Before there were cowboys, before there were missions, before any European flag flew over Texas, the Southern Plains belonged to the Comanche. Calling them a tribe does not do it justice. They were an empire. Starting in the late 1600s, the Comanche migrated south from the Rocky Mountains, acquired horses from the Spanish, and within a generation became arguably the most effective light cavalry in world history. Boys were riding bareback by age 6. Warriors could fire a dozen arrows at full gallop before a soldier with a musket could reload once. Their territory, Comancheria, stretched across 250,000 square miles of what is now Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Colorado. It was larger than the entire European-controlled area north of the Rio Grande. The Spanish Empire, one of the most powerful in human history, could not defeat them. The Comanche stopped Spain's northward expansion out of Mexico cold. They halted France's push westward from Louisiana. For over 150 years, they were the dominant power on the Southern Plains, running a trade and raiding network that reached from the Arkansas River deep into the Mexican interior. At their peak in the 1840s, Comanche war parties rode hundreds of miles into Mexico, sacking towns and returning with horses, captives, and goods. No other force in North America could project power across those distances. The Spanish knew they couldn't win, so they paid tribute. They gave gifts. They negotiated. And then the Americans arrived, and everything changed. Not because the Americans were better fighters, but because there were simply more of them, and they brought something the Comanche couldn't fight. Disease. Smallpox and cholera killed thousands. And the deliberate extermination of the buffalo, the animal the entire Comanche civilization depended on, finished the job. In 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie surprised a Comanche camp at Palo Duro Canyon at dawn, destroyed their winter supplies, and captured over 1,400 horses. The last free Comanche chief, Quanah Parker, the son of a white captive named Cynthia Ann Parker, surrendered shortly after. The lords of the Southern Plains were gone, and the LI of Texas began. Here's what they taught you. Brave American settlers came to Mexican Texas in the 1820s and 30s seeking freedom and opportunity. When the Mexican government became tyrannical, they fought for independence. Heroes died at the Alamo. Sam Houston won at San Jacinto. Texas was born. Here's what actually happened. Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821 and almost immediately abolished slavery. Texas at the time was a sparsely populated Mexican province. The Mexican government invited American settlers, led by Stephen F. Austin, to colonize the land. These settlers came overwhelmingly from the American South, and they brought enslaved people with them. Cotton was the only cash crop, and it required forced labor. Austin himself wrote in 1832 that nothing was wanted but money, and that enslaved people were necessary to make it. Every time the Mexican government moved to enforce its abolition laws, the Texas colonists pushed back. The tension was not about representation or tyranny. It was about slavery. When the Texas Revolution broke out in 1835, the Mexican army had explicit orders to free every enslaved person they encountered, and they did. The only person spared in the retaking of the Alamo was Joe, William Travis's enslaved man. While the defenders of the Alamo were fighting and dying, delegates at a constitutional convention were drafting the Republic of Texas Constitution. That document explicitly protected slavery, banned Congress from ever freeing enslaved people, and made it illegal for any freed black person to remain physically in the state. John Quincy Adams called the Texas Revolution the first civil war between slavery and emancipation, a full 25 years before Fort Sumter. The Republic of Texas has been called a dress rehearsal for the Confederacy. But the lie runs deeper than slavery. Tejanos, the Mexican Texans who had lived there for generations, fought and died alongside the Anglo settlers at the Alamo. Juan Seguin was a hero of the revolution, a cavalry commander who risked his life for Texas independence. After the war, Anglo settlers flooded in and repaid the Tejanos by running them out of San Antonio, stealing their land and threatening their lives. Seguin himself, despite everything he had done, was driven from Texas by death threats. Then Anglo writers got to work. They wrote the Tejanos out of the history books entirely. For over a century, the story of Texas was told as if it had been built exclusively by white Americans. The people Texas literally owes its existence to were erased from their own state's history. Texas joined the United States in 1845 and seceded to join the Confederacy in 1861, fighting explicitly to preserve slavery. After the Civil War came Reconstruction, then Jim Crow, and then something most Americans have never heard of. La Matanza, the slaughter. Between 1910 and 1920, during the chaos of the Mexican Revolution and border tensions, Texas Rangers and Anglo vigilantes launched a state-sanctioned campaign of racial violence against ethnic Mexicans. Estimates of the dead range from 300 to 5,000. Rangers lynched men without trial, burned homes, and seized land. They posed for photographs with the bodies and circulated the images as postcards. In January of 1918, Rangers from Company B rode into the tiny border village of Porvenir in the middle of the night. They dragged families from their beds at gunpoint. They separated 15 men and boys, the youngest 16, the oldest 72, and marched them into the desert. They shot all 15 at close range. The next day, the United States Army returned and burned the village to the ground. 140 survivors fled to Mexico. An investigation found the victims were defenseless and unarmed and killed without provocation. Not a single person was ever prosecuted. A state legislator named Jose Tomas Canales, the only Hispanic member of the Texas legislature, risked his life to demand an investigation into the Rangers. He was physically threatened by a ranger named Frank Hamer for even trying. The investigation confirmed widespread atrocities, but delivered no justice. The Rangers were merely reduced in size, and the textbooks stayed silent. If you are still watching, you are already learning history most people will never hear. If you want more like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel now. It takes 1 second, and it helps these stories reach the people who need them. This is perhaps the most insidious part of the Texas story. Because of the sheer size of the Texas market, textbook publishers for decades wrote their books to conform to Texas state curriculum standards, and then sold those same books to schools across the country. The Texas State Board of Education mandated that school children be taught a heroic version of Alamo history. Slavery was labeled a side issue of the Civil War. The board nearly erased Cesar Chavez from the curriculum entirely. Post-Civil War coverage failed to mention black codes, Jim Crow, sharecropping, or the Ku Klux Klan. What Texas teaches, America learns. For generations, millions of children were taught a version of history that was not incomplete. It was engineered. Meanwhile, Texas kept reinventing itself. On January 10, 1901, a gusher at Spindletop near Beaumont erupted with enough force to shoot oil 150 feet into the air. It produced 100,000 barrels a day, more than every other well in America combined. Spindletop transformed Texas from a cattle and cotton state into the center of the global petroleum industry overnight. Fortunes were made, cities exploded. Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth became powerhouses, but the oil wealth followed the same pattern that coal followed in Appalachia. Resources were pulled from the ground, profits concentrated at the top, and communities were left to deal with the consequences. That pattern is still playing out today in energy politics, power grid failures, and environmental fights across the state. Modern Texas has 29 million people. It is the second largest state in population and economy. Houston is the most ethnically diverse large city in America. 1 in 3 Texans is Hispanic. The state produces more wind energy than any other and more oil than most countries. It is a contradiction wrapped in a flag, simultaneously the most mythologized and the most misunderstood place in America. The Comanche ruled this land for 150 years, and most Texans can't name a single chief besides Quanah Parker. Tejanos bled for Texas independence and were written out of the story they helped create. Thousands of ethnic Mexicans were massacred by the state's own law enforcement, and it barely registers as a footnote. The Alamo is treated as sacred ground, but the Constitution written during the same battle enshrined slavery as untouchable law. The real history of Texas isn't less heroic than the myth. It is more. It is just harder to tell because it includes everyone, not just the people who got to write it down. If this changed how you see Texas, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let me know in the comments what history you want uncovered next. As always, we'll see you in the past.